This happened over 10 years ago, back when my spouse and I first started dating. We were staying at her mom's house to save money for our move to Austin. To pass the time, we often gathered in the laundry room, where we'd smoke cigarettes and talk for hours. One night, our conversation drifted to ghosts, and my spouse and her mom began sharing some truly spooky tales. They're seriously a treasure trove of paranormal experiences. In particular, they told me about the two men that haunted the property across the street. Many years ago, the story goes, these two men broke into the house, murdered the woman living there, and were gunned down by the police in the street not long after. They never left, and over time, they became increasingly intimidating. My spouse recounted a chilling experience she had when she arrived home around 4 a.m. after a night at the club. She parked her car, but before she could even get out, one of the men approached her car and began tapping on the passenger door. He just stood there, waiting for her to exit the vehicle. She was frozen with fear, refusing to move, but he didn't stop. He started moving along the exterior of the car, tapping slowly, methodically, down past the side, along the trunk. She didn't wait for him to round the car and approach the driver's door. She got the hell out of there, drove straight to Denny's, and didn't leave until the sun came up. At that point in my life, I'd never really experienced anything that couldn't be explained scientifically. But I believed her. My spouse, after all, knows the difference between an engine that knocks a little after it's been switched off, and something moving along the exterior of her car. Even still, I wasn't scared myself. Nothing non-corporeal had ever shaken me. But that changed a few weeks later. I had just returned home from a work shift around 5:30 in the morning, and I had to leave for my parents' home, about an hour away. It was a cold morning, and my car was a verified junker that took forever to warm up. I sat there, engine running, sipping coffee, trying my best not to doze off right there in the driver's seat. Then, out of the corner of my left eye, I saw movement. I looked over, but all I could see was the vacant, reportedly haunted house across the street. Nothing was there. I chalked it up to a shadow, or maybe my groggy brain playing tricks on me, and went back to caffeinating myself before hitting the road. But I kept seeing movement, a shadow, growing bigger, closer to my car. Yet every time I looked directly at it, nothing. Eventually, I decided to stop looking. I kept my eyes forward, hoping whatever it was, or whatever I thought I was seeing, would just go away. It didn't. The shadow, it took shape, forming into the vague silhouette of a stout. I could see him, out of the corner of my eye, oddly clear despite the peripheral view. He had no distinct features, just this dark, oozing presence, like he was made of tar. Imagine a portly voodoo doll doused in crude oil. That's the best way I can describe it. Seeing him was bad enough, but then, he moved, right up to my window. He didn't tap, didn't knock, just stood there, staring at me, even though he had no eyes, nothing I could make out. I didn't wait long after that. My car was warmed up enough, and I hightailed it out of there. The adrenaline alone was enough to keep me awake on the road. Later that night, I called my then-girlfriend, now spouse, and told her, "I think I met one of the men who haunts the house across the street this morning." She didn't miss a beat. "Oh? Which one? The tall, skinny guy, or the fat tar man?" Years ago, I interned at a recording studio in NYC, a place that was technically open 24/7. Someone was always there, whether clients were in or not. The studio was on an upper floor of a building, and due to the expensive equipment inside, accessing that floor by elevator was no simple task. The button for that floor was locked out. You couldn't press it from inside the elevator. There were cameras everywhere, one at the front entrance downstairs, another at the elevator entrance, and even one inside the elevator. All of these could be viewed from the front desk of the studio. So when people arrived, you'd buzz them in, wait until you saw them enter the elevator, and then you'd have to push the button for the studio floor to bring the elevator up. Well, one night, I was working the overnight shift. It was just me and another guy, who was doing cleaning and maintenance. It was probably around 3:30 in the morning when we suddenly heard the elevator start running. Now, this whole building is filled with offices, so by that time, there's really nobody left in the building besides us. We thought it was a bit strange. The other guy looks at the cameras, and there's nothing. No one in the elevator, nothing at all. We just figured maybe someone was still in the building and called it from a different floor. It seemed logical enough, until we saw it stop at our floor, and we heard the door ding. We were both in the lobby, about 15 feet away from the elevator. We gave each other the hardest, WTF, stare you can imagine. I can't even begin to explain how much I didn't want those doors to open. We just stood there, staring, like deer caught in headlights, completely motionless as the doors slid open. Nothing. Nobody. No one pushed the button, nothing. We kept staring, completely still, completely silent. And it got really, really creepy. The doors didn't shut, as if something was standing there, blocking the sensor. The doors usually close after about 5 seconds, but we stood there, watching, for a good 20, maybe 30 seconds, before they finally closed, and the elevator returned back to the lobby. We stared at each other a bit longer before we both simultaneously said, "What the f***, dude?" The next day, we asked a couple of the other guys about it, and one of them said the same thing had happened to him in the middle of the night when he was by himself. He said he almost shit himself. Maybe there's a logical explanation for it. Maybe the elevator malfunctioned. But it was really damn freaky, especially since the place was generally kinda creepy at night, and there had been some other weird things. I don't do nights anymore, but for years, I worked night shifts in residential care facilities. One of the spookiest experiences was at a sole-charge dementia facility. 15 residents, all of whom required constant attention, and no one but me to keep an eye on them all. Around 3 a.m., after finishing my intentional rounds, where I checked that all the residents were safe and well, I heard the doorbell ring. A sudden wave of goosebumps washed over me. This was a secure facility, and it was the middle of the night. I hesitated, my heart racing, before heading to the window. I looked out, but there was no one there. I tried to blow it off as a hallucination, my mind playing tricks on me. But 10 minutes later, it rang again. I was shitting myself. I went back to the window, peering through the glass, but again, no one was there. I glanced across the street and noticed a strange car parked there, its dark silhouette blending into the shadows. I quickly took a photo of it, just in case, and then returned to my station, where I had been playing a game of Match the Card Suits, with a delightful, yet very demented lady. I sat down, trying to shake off the dread, and she looked at me with a peculiar intensity. "What did the gentleman want, dearie? He looked like he had a bad night and needs a cuppa." Chills crept down my spine, but I brushed it off. Hallucinations were common with dementia, and this lady was particularly prone to losing her sense of time and place. The doorbell rang again, less than 5 minutes later. This time, I was freaking the f*** out. I noticed another resident wandering the hallway, painting, with a clean paintbrush to keep him occupied. I passed him on my way to the front window, and he turned to me, his voice low and eerie. "Don't answer the door alone. He might hurt you." I was f***ing myself. Trying not to cry, I didn't know what to do. I was a single 23-year-old female in charge of 15 people with varying stages of dementia, and the doorbell kept ringing in the dead of night. It was the weekend, so my on-call wouldn't answer the phone. She never did on weekends. I looked out the window again and saw that same car parked across the street. As I scanned the area, I noticed a shadow moving in front of the door. Suddenly, a figure walked around the corner and looked straight into the window beside me. We made eye contact. I screamed. My residents began to freak out, their voices rising in alarm, while the figure just bolted away from the window. Panic surged through me. I called the police, and chaos ensued. 2 police officers arrived, and with them came the tumult of noise. My 15 residents had all been woken by the commotion, and now they were confronted with the presence of uniformed officers in their space. My on-call still wasn't answering, and I struggled to manage the overwhelming situation. Eventually, after many cups of tea and Milo, and 2 rounds of PRN meds for the more challenging residents, we were mostly settled. The clock struck 7 a.m., and the handover shift arrived, a nurse and a caregiver. I told them what happened, my voice trembling as I recounted the night's events. They shared with me that a woman down the road had been attacked in her bed by a drug seeker who had ransacked her house looking for drugs. I felt an internal meltdown begin to swell within me. We had drugs in the cupboard in the med room, good drugs too. Morphine, methadone, fentanyl, and more. I couldn't help but wonder if the intruder had been intentionally looking for us and had just taken the next best option. For reference, the facility was an old converted boarding house in a gentrified area, surrounded by lots of old doctors' houses. It was easy to mistake my home for a regular house. I left that job not long after because they refused to hire a second person for night shifts, despite it being understaffed according to best practice guidelines. I hadn't thought of that night in maybe 5 years, until now. The thought still sends chills down my spine. It was the quiet hours of the night shift, when the hospital's eerie stillness magnifies the sound of every breath, every heartbeat, until they stop. I sat at her bedside, the dim light casting long shadows, and held her thin hand as her breathing slowed to a whisper. I watched as her eyes, once filled with life, became fixed and glazed, her skin turning pale and waxy, almost as if the night itself had seeped into her being. I leant forward, putting my ear close to her lips, straining to catch the remnants of her final breath as it whispered into the void. The death rattle that followed signified the end. A life had been lived, and now it was over. I let go of her cooling hand, the chill of death already beginning to settle, and placed my stethoscope against her chest. Listening, though I knew there would be nothing to hear. The silence confirmed what I already knew, but the ritual grounded me, kept me tethered to the routine that had carried me through so many of these moments during the night shift. I stood up, taking one last view of the scene before me, the dim light highlighting the stillness of her form beneath the sheets. Taking a deep breath to steady myself, I stepped out from behind the privacy curtain, dimming the light as I moved towards the duty station across the passage. The quiet hum of the night shift followed me, a constant reminder of the time and place where life and death often met. Dr. Bobat answered after 4 rings, his voice groggy with sleep. "Yes?" he mumbled. "Sorry to wake you, Dr. Bobat. It's Sister Turner from Ward 3B. I'm afraid Mrs. Powell has just passed away." "Edna Powell? Really?" he asked, a note of surprise in his voice. "I really thought she would hang on for a few more days." "So did I replied, glancing back towards Edna's now lifeless form. "I noticed she was struggling when I checked on her half an hour or so ago, so I increased her oxygen flow and sat with her." "Ah, bless you, Christine. She was fortunate to have you with her. They certainly don't make nurses like you anymore." I smiled at his compliment, though it was bittersweet. "Shall I notify the family?" "Please. And could you draw up the death certificate? I'll sign it in the morning during rounds." "Will do, doctor." I disconnected the call, letting the silence of the night shift envelop me once more, and fetched Mrs. Powell's file from the pigeonhole marked Bed 12, just as Avril returned from the tea lounge. "What's up?" she asked, her voice a welcome break in the stillness. I told her about Mrs. Powell's passing, the words coming easily after so many years of working the night shift. "How sad. Such a sweet old lady. I really thought she would have been with us a few more days." She handed me a notice of death form from the top drawer, and I began filling it out, the pen scratching against the paper in the otherwise silent ward. It wasn't unusual for people to die on our shift. Ward 3B was where they sent patients who had exceeded all their options. Many of these were, "Do not resuscitate patients, for us to take care of and make comfortable in their final days." Edna Powell had been one such patient. End-stage bowel cancer. Her file was filled with the grim details of a long, hard battle. I picked up the handheld and dialed the next of kin listed on Edna Powell's file. Her daughter sobbed quietly as I reassured her that her mother had not been alone and had passed away peacefully. My voice was calm, practiced, an anchor in the storm of grief. "Thank you, Sister Christine. You have no idea how comforting it is for me to hear that you were with her in her final moments." She opted not to come to the hospital, preferring to remember her mother as she had been in life. "I understand. Many families make that choice," I said gently, the night shift having taught me the importance of respecting such decisions. I explained that someone would be in contact with her in the morning with a list of funeral homes and details for the collection of the death certificate. I reiterated how sorry I was for her loss, my words like a balm, even though I knew they could never truly heal the wound of loss. "You really are incredible, you know," Avril said as I hung up. "What do you mean?" I asked, picking up the form and continuing to fill it out. "Just the way you are with people. I don't think I'll ever get used to telling people their family member just died. You just do it so calmly and flawlessly. 20 years on the job." I sighed and wrote 11H23 next to time of death, the weight of those years pressing down on me. Avril notified the mortuary, as I quickly completed the rest of the details on the form. When I was done, she went to check on the other patients in the ward, while I returned to Edna Powell's silent room to prepare her body for the afterlife. The night shift routine was like a well-rehearsed play, each act carried out with precision and care. Her oxygen mask lay where I had placed it on her pillow, to keep her final breaths unfettered. I disconnected the oxygen and her drip bag, then removed her venous port from her hand. My hands looked almost red against her translucent blue skin, which was colder than it had been earlier. Dropping the mask, port, drip bag, and tubing into the red incineration bin, I listened to the familiar jingling of the equipment falling onto the used medicine vials. The sound echoed in the silence of the night shift, a final goodbye to the tools that had kept her alive. I opened an antiseptic swab and began wiping her face and neck, my bare hands moving gently over her cooling skin. I didn't wear gloves. I preferred it that way, the connection between us more personal, more real. I rolled her frail, cancer-ravaged body onto her side and untied her hospital gown. Working quickly, I cleaned her front and back, then placed an absorbent pad beneath her pelvis to catch the fluids that would soon drain from her body. There was certainly no dignity in death, but I tried to offer what little comfort I could. Finally, I positioned her thin arms close to her sides to make it easier for the undertakers when rigor mortis set in. Once Edna Powell's corpse was cleaned and positioned, I leaned over her face and peered into her lifeless eyes. "Goodbye, old lady," I whispered, closing her eyes with the palm of my hand, the final act of the night shift routine. I was startled by Avril's voice from behind the curtain. "Need some help?" "All done," I said quickly, pulling the sheet over Edna Powell's face, covering her from the world she had left behind. The rest of the night shift passed relatively uneventfully. The porters removed Edna Powell to the mortuary. Mrs. Johnson needed a sedative to help her sleep, and Mrs. Jamal needed additional pain meds, which I administered from the Schedule 7 cupboard, documenting it carefully in the register. I took my tea break on the third-floor balcony adjacent to Ward 3B, the cool night air a welcome relief after the heavy stillness of the ward. As I watched the sun rise serenely over the sleeping city, I thought about how today the world would be different because there was one less person in it. The night shift had come to an end, but the weight of it lingered. At 7 o'clock, I left Avril to do handover to the day's staff and fetched my bag from my locker. I scanned my access card and took the elevator to the ground floor, the hum of the night shift still echoing in my ears. Taking the long route out of the hospital, I turned left down the hallway where the Employee of the Year awards were displayed. I paused to look at a framed photo of a younger me. Senior Christine Turner, RN, Employee of the Year 2018. I smiled to myself. This is why I do what I do. On the bus home, I gazed out the window, watching the city wake up as I was about to sleep. The night shift was over, but its effects lingered. I thought of Edna Powell, now permanently sleeping. Death is a strange concept. We always say, "Rest in peace," But do the dearly departed really rest? Is peace not just the end of suffering? When it came to Edna Powell, I knew the answer. Despite my long shift, I felt invigorated, thinking about the role I had played in her passing. I had held the hands of many people as they took their last breath and passed to the other side. While most of them had been expected to die, not one of them had been ready to die. Each family, every doctor had been grateful for me having been with the patient as they took their final breath. In fact, I had been told that it was my empathy with terminal patients and their families that had led to